Well, welcome back. Thank you for everyone who's joined us today. I'm going to get us started, even though I know some people will probably trickle in over the next 5 minutes. If you haven't met me, my name is Derek Fung. I'm convening this wildfire seminar series this quarter. Again, apologies last week for our technical glitches with the talk from PG&E. We might do a special seminar in the winter to bring Andy back. But thank you for your attention and for your patience last week. We are here talking about some very important issues related to wildfires this quarter, and I'm glad you've joined us. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we are supported by the Bill Lane Center for the American West, the Woods Institute, and finally Stanford Sustainability Data Science, who have supported this seminar series. I am excited and thrilled for our speaker today because I think we need fresh young minds to look at this prevalent human and planetary problem we're tackling. And I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, who is Georgia Scarr, who I've gotten to know a little bit over the past year, as she's been an undergraduate researcher at the Bill Lane Center for the American West. But she's not just an undergraduate, she is heavily invested and interested in the wildfire problem. She has served as a wildland firefighter herself, as well as volunteering to do locally some prescribed burns. She even recently convened a workshop at the Cambridge Science Festival looking at science and the reality of wildfires. She's also the co-founder and co-director of a nonprofit called EcoCircle International and is co-president of Stanford Outdoor Outreach Program. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the screen and screen sharing capabilities to Georgia, and looking forward to hearing her talk about some of the work she's been doing over the past year. Welcome, Georgia, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll start just by sharing my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about wildfire mitigation, and particularly my research with the Bill Lane Center with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. Today, we're actually lucky enough to have some people from the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority here. Mark Brown, who's the executive officer, and also Caitlin, who works with Panorama, that's the consulting agency with the MWPA. So I'm going to start out just by giving some context specifically with California and wildfires, the history of both wildfire suppression and wildfire mitigation in California, and kind of the context of where that's led us today. I'm going to go into a bit about wildfire behavior and how this is relevant when discussing wildfire mitigation tactics, and then going on to the research with the MWPA and kind of our lessons that we've learned with that in terms of environmental compliance and wildfire mitigation. So a bit about me. I won't go into too much depth, as I think Derek did a lovely work with the introduction, but I'm an undergraduate researcher with the Bill Lane Center, and I also work as a wildland firefighter. So first of all, why are wildfires in California so important? I just want to start with this really impactful image from the McKinney fire last year in Klamath National Forest. And so over the past kind of the history of California, the most destructive wildfires we've seen have actually just been since 2015. And I think this is really important to emphasize when people discuss that wildfires are natural. Yes, they're certainly natural. And a big point I want to emphasize throughout this presentation is that fire is natural, and it's important to include it as a part of the landscape. But these huge fires that we're seeing here, and kind of these mega fires that we're calling them, they're becoming more prominent and more destructive. That is not a natural process that we're seeing, and that's why it's especially requiring our attention now. And even with climate change, since the early 1900s to now, we've seen there's been an increase in the average temperatures in California, and that is increasing wildfire risk, as we're seeing more droughts and higher temperatures drying out those fuels, making them more available to burn in fires. So a brief history of wildfire management in the United States. So pre-20th century, and kind of especially pre the colonization of the United States, when indigenous people were caring for this land, wildfires were allowed to burn as they naturally would, and their natural cycle is important for ecological practices, but also it was a large part of kind of culture for a lot of tribes across what we now know as the United States. So a lot of this is called cultural burning. So that's used for land regeneration, herding animals, nurturing land to support specific vegetation. It's even required for kind of the spreading of seeds for certain species. So very important. And then as we kind of enter the 20th century, there are a lot of policies put in place to suppress wildfires. Really important kind of for the health and safety of people, especially as we expanded the wildland urban interface called the WUI, and people were living in places close to nature. But this has caused a buildup of fuels, which we'll talk about throughout the rest of this presentation. But an example of one of these policies is the 10 a.m. policy. So that was implemented in 1935. And that required fire managers to put out all human-caused fires by 10 a.m. the following day. And in 1944, the Smokey Bear campaign was launched, as we all know. Fun fact, Smokey Bear is one of two in the United States actually has their own zip code. So yeah, we got really good in the United States with suppressing wildfires. Once again, really important for health and safety of people, but also, as we've started to discover now, this has kind of created unintended consequences. But then kind of in the later 20th century, for example, in 1968, the National Park Service started to allow prescribed burns. Prescribed burns, as I'll kind of discuss a bit more later, is the deliberate burning of the land for specific purposes, whether that be reduction of fuels or for ecological purposes and kind of regeneration of the landscape. And then kind of now we're starting to see more of the importance of not just wildfire suppression, but also wildfire mitigation and fuels management. For example, in 2018, the government spent a record-breaking $3.1 billion on wildfire management. And so one thing that's important to understand as we are mitigating wildfires, we're kind of also predicting their behavior. And so there's a few things that we know ahead of time about how wildfires behave. So I wanted to cover some of this as well, just so people got some context. So first of all, we have topography. So this is the shape of the landscape. Some examples of this include the slope. I'm going to have an example of this on the next slide, but the slope can impact wildfire behavior as well as other factors. For example, if it's a south-facing slope, the fuel is typically more available to burn as it is drying up throughout the day. Getting more of that sun exposure is more available to burn and is a higher fire risk. So the impact of slope here. So we have these 5 different conditions, and this was taken from a really interesting kind of research paper that I've cited here. And so these 5 different conditions, so a negative 20 degree slope, negative 10 degree slope, flat, and then 10 degrees, 20 degrees. So we're going to watch a simulation here, and we're going to see how the fire moves differently across these different slopes. So as you can see, there's actually a really significant difference in this wildfire behavior, and that's important both when kind of managing wildfires whilst they're actually burning, but also thinking about that ahead of time when we're creating things such as fuel breaks, which we'll discuss, which are kind of removements of certain bits of vegetation to slow or stop the spread of fire. And another impact of terrain, this is actually a model of Yosemite. And so you can see the different terrains here. And kind of at first glance, if you're not thinking too much about the different factors influencing wildfire behavior, you might think it would just spread evenly across the landscape. But there's a few different factors here. For example, you can see there's rock, so the lack of vegetation, fires would not be able to burn in those areas, in addition to different slopes, as we can see. So we'll see on the next slide. It's going to go faster and slower in certain areas. See here it's burns very quickly up some of the steeper slopes and then burns out once it gets to areas with a lack of vegetation. And as well, I find this particularly interesting on the front here. You can see it's like slowly coming through this flat area. The river that's running through it acts as a natural fuel break, but then it very quickly comes up the side there as it gets steeper and it's able to burn. So another impact, which is another factor which is particularly relevant when discussing wildfire mitigation, is fuels. So this is, once again, a variety of different factors within fuels, such as the tree type, which we'll see in a simulation, as well as just the amount of vegetation. So here you can see fuel loading, which is basically the amount of vegetation in the area. So there's 25% forest cover, 45%, and 90%. And like I said, particularly relevant when discussing wildfire mitigation. One method of wildfire mitigation, a form of fuels reduction, is mechanical thinning, where you use mechanized equipment to remove certain vegetation from the landscape. So you could turn, depending on the prescription for the certain area, which is typically considering the wildfire risk as well as the kind of ecological and biodiversity conditions of the area, but you could turn something that is 9% forest cover to a lesser forest cover. We'll see that makes a big impact, as we'll see in this simulation here. Here, there's a huge difference. It just rips through the 90%, and that's a risk not only for the amount of destruction that could occur, but also the speed at which it spreads and how close those fuels are. That gives it less time for members of the public to evacuate, and also less time for wildland firefighters to come in and safely prevent it from spreading further. Tree type is another factor that influences wildfire behavior. So certain trees are more available to burn than others. For example, coniferous trees typically burn faster than deciduous trees. And that's another thing we bear in mind when we're kind of creating different fuel breaks or doing mechanical thinning, is what trees are more available to burn. And so here in the simulation, the darker trees are coniferous and the lighter trees are deciduous. We'll see here how that impacts. So you can see it's going through really quickly, and then once it hits those deciduous trees, it starts to burn a lot slower. They still are available to burn, but they are a reduced fire risk. And then finally, factor influencing wildfire behavior is weather. And this can include a variety of things, but wind is something really that we think about. Wind and temperature as well. Temperature can impact factors such as the relative humidity, the RH value, and that is the humidity of the area, and that has a large impact as well on how dry those fuels are. But wind is another factor. And I find wind particularly interesting because, as we'll see on this next slide, whilst it can make the fire move faster, high wind isn't always correlated with a higher fire risk, depending. So we've got 0 meters per second, 10 meters per second, and 30 meters per second on this one. So you can see the 30 meters per second moved by far the fastest, but by the end, it's now actually used up a lot of the fuels that it had burned through, and the fire went out quicker, whereas 0 meters per second here, although it moved slower, it was able to, compared to the others, actually burn more fuels. But despite the fact that in the end it burned more fuels, hopefully because it moved slower, it would give the public more time to evacuate and also more time for wildland firefighters to come in, set up what they need to do to slow that rate of spread and or stop it. Okay. So next up, going to be talking a bit more about the specifics of fuels reduction. So I've been kind of talking about prescribed burns, mechanical thinning, and fuel breaks, but I wanted to kind of clarify what those are. So prescribed burns, you can see actually a picture of me here taken by Xander, actually, who I think's watching here today. And so that's a prescribed burn. So while the firefighters come in and they deliberately set the land on fire, like I mentioned, for fuels reduction is an important thing that we're speaking about today. So making these forests less dense, because like I've mentioned before, fire is a natural part of the landscape, and that is naturally regulating the amount of fuels in areas. But due to decades now of fire suppression, there's a lot of buildup of these fuels. So it's about safely and effectively putting fire back onto the land, and how can we be managing the amount of fuel that is available there. But prescribed burns can also be important, for example, for invasive species. That's another use of prescribed burns, deliberately burning areas with certain invasive species to reduce the population size. And mechanical thinning, that's another form of fuels reduction. So the use of a chainsaw is a common form of mechanical thinning. There's a picture of me there with a chainsaw. But there's also different kinds of mechanized equipment that can be used. For example, a masticator, just kind of hard to describe, but I suggest looking up a video of it. It looks quite cool. They almost like eat trees and they go around, and that's an interesting mechanized equipment that's used for mechanical thinning. and kind of not necessarily a technique, but a method that's important in fuels reduction are fuel breaks. So this is creating, hence the name, a break in the fuel, and this can be done kind of in the moment when you are fighting fires. You can create fuel breaks to slow the spread, but also ahead of time. This can be created and planned to protect certain areas, particularly homes, and we'll discuss some fuel breaks that the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority has created throughout Marin and the importance of that. But that can be really important, and not only slowing the spread, but can also, in certain cases, stop the spread of fires, depending on the conditions. Okay, so now on to discuss the research and the research that I've been doing with the Bill Lane Center. So I started working at the Bill Lane Center in the spring, and then I worked on a fuels crew and an engine crew in Idaho over the summer, and now I'm back working with the Bill Lane Center this fall. But I wanted to start out by highlighting some of the amazing other undergraduate researchers that have been working on wildfire research with the Bill Lane Center. So we have Caitlin, Lily, Alex, Lucian, and John, and I've used some of their graphics throughout this presentation. I've kind of noted who's created those different ones. Okay, so the objective of our research. So a few years ago, the MWPA, the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, came to Stanford to see how we could collaborate in researching the work that they are doing and the effectiveness of that, the history of the MWPA. That was a research project that was done by an undergraduate researcher a few years ago. But now this year, the project that we ended up narrowing down is evaluating the strategies that the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority has used to streamline the fuels reduction environmental compliance process, enabling them to act at scale in an environmentally sensitive way. So dealing with environmental compliance and how you create projects at scale, yet still in an environmentally sensitive way, is a really pertinent issue, especially with a lot of the environmental crises becoming even more time sensitive. We need to create these land management processes in an efficient way, both for time and resources and people, but also in a way that is still caring for our environment. And something I think that the MWPA has done really well throughout this is still ensuring detailed environmental compliance and caring for the land, whilst also still understanding that wildfire mitigation is something that is really important, not only for the people, but for the environment as well. And how can we do that in an effective way? And so some of the key takeaways of this research that I'll kind of expand throughout the rest of this presentation: careful use of specific CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, exemption clauses for relevant smaller projects, but for some of the relevant larger projects, they've been expedited through the Cal Vegetation Treatment Program, which I'll discuss. As well as something that I found particularly interesting has been their work to engage stakeholders, both through informal meetings, as well as different more formalized committees. So then what is the MWPA specifically? I've mentioned before, it's the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, but to go into the specifics on this, it's a partnership between stakeholders in Marin County, specifically 17 different member agencies, and they work together to address wildfire prevention efforts, to develop fire-adapted communities through a joint powers authority funded by a parcel tax called Measure C, which is about $19 million annually through this tax, in addition to additional grants that I'll discuss throughout. But they were officially launched in 2020, so relatively new, but have been doing great work over the past several years. And so two of the ways that I've discussed that I'm going to expand on are their use of CEQA exemptions and the California Vegetation Treatment Program. And earlier at the start of this presentation, I mentioned Panorama. So they are the environmental consultants that work with the MWPA to kind of produce these documents and ensure kind of successful environmental permitting processes. So CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, so it was an environmental statute passed in 1970, and it requires public agencies to consider the environmental consequences of projects, informing government decision makers and the public and the potential environmental effects of proposed activities. So what CEQA to me basically boils down to is looking at how does this project impact the environment? Is there any way we can mitigate this? And therefore, can we do this project? So a really important process, but also some of these CEQA environmental impact reports can be hundreds, if not thousands of pages. So it's kind of a really thorough process, which is important to ensure kind of protection of the environment, but also particularly with smaller projects, not always necessary. You can get some of the same kind of environmental compliance and care for our environment in a more efficient way. So this is what leads to the development of the CEQA Notice of Exemptions, also known as the CEQA NOE, sometimes it's abbreviated too. So for projects that meet the criteria, the MWPA has used exemptions where appropriate for smaller projects. And so they've kind of have the statistics on the next slide, but they've made a lot of projects through these notices of exemptions, which has allowed them to kind of address these small projects in a way that would previously take about up to a year with the CEQA environmental impact report, which is the traditional way of going through this. But through the notice of exemptions, they can take about 2 weeks to 2 months. But despite the fact that it's shorter, I think it's been clear to me through looking through all the documentation that corners have not been cut, and between the MWPA and Panorama, there's still detailed environmental compliance. This is just done in a more efficient and streamlined way. And it's particularly been streamlined as a lot of these projects are done across different jurisdictions. But due to the collaboration of these different member agencies across different jurisdictions within Marin, it allows that collaboration that without the MWPA would be very, very difficult, kind of just communicating documentation and having to redo different permits for different areas. So this has been a really efficient way of going about so many projects. And just to clarify, the main forms of the CEQA exemptions that have been used, the categorical and the statutory, mostly categorical has been used, and these are typically used for specific small projects. So these include modifying existing structures, minor alterations to the land, environmental restoration for under 5 acres, and constructing new structures. And Alex Schaefer from Over the Summer created this this graphic that I think really kind of concisely puts some complex information into the different types of exemptions that can be used. So some statistics here about what exactly they've used the notices of exemptions for. So they've used them for over 42 projects in Marin between 2021 and 2023 alone, which is really significant considering, as I said on one of the prior slides, that some of these projects, if gone through the traditional environmental impact report, would take up to a year. And as I've also been talking about the wildfire risk in California with the issue of wildfire suppression over the decades, and in addition to the issue of climate change, it's becoming more and more severe. So it's really emphasizing the fact that whilst prioritizing our environment, we also need to be getting these projects out and done to protect communities and the environment. And this totals 1,127 acres, and it's adjacent to 3,867 homes, which is really substantial. So it's protecting a lot of homes in Marin County, and that is a really significant kind of aspect of this, because a lot of Marin County is what, as I described before, is the wildland-urban interface, the WUI, and that is a really high wildfire risk for property destruction. So having these wildfire mitigation methods around all these homes is protecting both property, but also, really importantly, the people. And here we have an example of one of their projects, which are the San Rafael zone fire roads, which is vegetation removal and enhancement. And this was done around those roads. And some of the really important things here with fuels reduction methods is, besides just making fuel less available to burn and reducing wildfire risk to slow the spread, a lot of it is also about having access for wildland firefighters to come in the event of a fire, but also access for the public to evacuate during that. And that's something as well that the MWPA has been working on. So this project is an example of how they've been making those roads safer and more accessible in a wildfire. Because as you can imagine in the before picture, if a wildfire was going through that road would be difficult, if at all even possible, to drive through if it was on fire on both sides. And an example of one of the projects that have used the notice of exemption is the Ring Mountain Fuel Break. So this project was about 48 acres and it took less than a month to get approved, and really want to emphasize kind of how impressive, at least I found this, comparing that again to a year, which is the comparative timeline that I mentioned. Without an NOE, it would have taken at least 3 months, but more likely up to a year. And so the notice of exemption, as I mentioned, has been used for the smaller projects, but for the larger projects that kind of require more documentation, the MWPA has approached this with a different method, and they've used the CalVTP, which is the California Vegetation Treatment Program. And so this was something that I found really interesting to look into. So the California government has created the California Programmatic Environmental Impact Report. So they've already made an EIR. And basically what using the VTP entails is then creating a project-specific analysis underneath that. So you're still looking really in depth. These documents are still hundreds of pages looking into the environmental impact or potential environmental impact of these projects. But rather than having to do and redo for each project an entirely new environmental impact report, you're able to say, we've already established a lot of these environmental impacts associated, but now we're going to do a project-specific analysis and an addendum underneath that. And the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority has really still done this in, whilst an efficient way, still a very thorough way. They did a lot of wildfire modeling for the 2 projects that they've done so far underneath this, which I'll talk about on the next slide, the 2 big fuel breaks they've used the CalVTP for. So first of all, there's the Greater Ross Valley shaded fuel break. And so this is a 38-mile long shaded fuel break. So this is huge, you know, just to put that into context. Some of the fuel breaks I was working on over the summer kind of would only stretch the length of a couple hundred feet. And now we're talking 38 miles across different jurisdictions. So this is something that is particularly unique and would be really great to see as well now implemented on a wider scale, not just through the MWPA, because with wildfire risk increasing, you know, wildfire obviously isn't spreading in terms of jurisdictions. So creating these fuel breaks that are going across these different jurisdictions is something that's really impactful and can also help a lot of people and properties and the environment. And so this is running across 17,000 pieces of real estate. So once again, that's huge. We're talking about the wildland urban interface. We're now talking going across nearly 2,000 pieces of real estate. That's really impactful. And as well, that was started to plan in the 2021 to 2022 year. Now it's currently in the process of being implemented and is planned to hopefully be done by 2024. And the funding involved in this both came from those Measure C funds that I stated at the beginning, from that parcel tax, but also from a CAL FIRE grant. CAL FIRE is basically the California Wildfire Agency. And the budget for this was about $3.25 million, which I think is a really efficient use of taxpayer money if you then think about the nearly 2,000 different pieces of real estate that you're protecting with this fuel break from potentially a really harmful wildfire. And next we have the Greater Novato shaded fuel break, which is the other fuel break that was used through the California Vegetation Treatment Program. And so this project was done after the previous one, but is an even larger scale. So now it's 3,463 acres, and this is across the entire Novato zone. And the timeline of this, it's a relatively new project, so it's being implemented in the mid to late year this year and will continue into 2024. And it's anticipated to be a 5-year project. And like I said, this project is a bit substantially larger than the prior fuel break I discussed, and the funding is approximately $8 million. And once again, comparing the timeline on these different projects and what this is in perspective to the normal environmental compliance process. So Panorama, the consulting agency for the MWPA, when they did the Mount Sutro vegetation management plan for a different agency, they went through the process of a typical EIR for the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA EIR. And this documentation was over 2,000 pages and 300 comments. So whilst really, in depth in terms of the analysis of this, that's a lot of kind of processing to go through. So the kind of steps of this is finding out that the CEQA project is not exempt. So you could not use a notice of exemption for it, as discussed previously. Then participating in an initial study, creating a notice of preparation and a draft of the EIR, and then a public commentary and response. Then you have a final EIR as well as a decision on the project. And so another thing that can also make the EIR take a substantially long time is the need for public commentary and public response. And so that can actually speed up when you're going through the process, such as the CalVTP. But as I'll discuss a bit later when I talk about the stakeholder engagement that the MWPA has done, they've still chosen to kind of get a lot of public commentary and feedback on their projects to ensure that the public is behind them on this, and it's also really serving their needs. And so a comparison of the timeline with the MWPA, the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break Project, the Greater Novato Shaded Fuel Break Project. So that goes through notice of project planning, designing the project, completing the project-specific analysis for that CalVTP, discovering that it's in the scope of the finding, and then having it approved. So kind of a lot more streamlined of a process where you're still able to really, in detail, analyze the potential environmental impacts, how you can mitigate that, but then actually kind of putting that into action faster and protecting communities sooner. And so another factor that the MWPA has used to streamline their environmental compliance process is involving stakeholders. So 3 different ways that we identified that they have done this. So the ESP partnership, the Citizens Oversight Committee, and then through active public engagement efforts for stakeholders and members of the public that aren't even a part of these committees. So first of all, the Ecologically Sound Practices Partnership. So it's a collaboration between fire agencies and the environmental community in Marin, and they assist the MWPA in protecting the environment. So throughout the kind of MWPA project planning purposes, this allows them to still be putting the environment at the forefront of a lot of their decisions. So whilst they're still streamlining this process, making it more efficient, it doesn't mean that they're kind of not prioritizing the environmental impact of that. And then another important way they've engaged with different stakeholders is the Citizens Oversight Committee. So this is basically different groups, as I've listed here, from not just environmental groups, but also taxpayer groups, fire prevention groups, etc. And that's ensuring that the tax funds that they've decided to allocate to different projects, that's being followed through with. And that's also really ensuring that the local community is behind them on these projects, and able to really kind of get feedback on that and ensure that the kind of tax money is being used appropriately and efficiently, like we've been seeing. And another really successful way that the MWPA has been engaging with the local community and also getting community support on these projects, which in turn is making it faster. And community support we have had a lot of public comments analyzed, which I'll describe on the next slide, and how we've over time been able to see that community support for these projects has increased. So examples of how they're engaging with these stakeholders and members of the community is they meet with environmental stakeholders at least once a month. They often host webinars with environmental stakeholders and experts to show not just environmental groups, but members of the public kind of how the MWPA is approaching these different environmental issues. And I'd also like to emphasize these are things that the MWPA has decided to go above and beyond to do. These aren't things that are required, by the CalVTP. So, they're putting environmental issues at the forefront of a lot of this wildfire mitigation, whilst they're still ensuring that it's done in a timely manner to kind of protect members of the public. And they've also been doing field trips to project sites. So members of the public can go and actually see what these projects are, see the fuel breaks. I think that's something that as a member of the public can also make it kind of less intimidating, a lot of this wildfire mitigation work, and quite many fears that they might have about chainsaws running, etc., or just environmental concerns as well. They're just a few examples. And so John Lester, who's one of the undergraduate researchers over the summer, he took about 148 different public meetings, and he coded the comments in accordance of positive and negative. And as we've seen here over the since 2021, as these stakeholder engagement and public engagement efforts have increased, and they've actively been listening to what they've been saying in these more informal meetings, as opposed to these public meetings in terms of, are these projects going to be approved or not? They're able to do that ahead of time. Kind of, they've been saying in our interviews that we've done with the MWPA and Panorama, they've taken an approach of no surprises. So both members of the public and the stakeholders know what they're going to be doing ahead of time. And also the MWPA and Panorama can see any of their concerns, feedback on it, and act upon it. And this really streamlines that environmental compliance process, because rather than going into these public meetings, encountering these public comments that are perhaps fighting back against questions that could have been answered in these more informal meetings, they're able to both prioritize public needs and environmental compliance as well. So as we can see, that's gone down substantially over time. And so kind of emphasizing the importance of these informal stakeholder meetings, like I discussed. So the interviewees felt that the informal meetings held outside of the public projects, they were effective in reducing public contestation against projects, like shown on the prior graph. And so they were instituted in 2021, which is when the data set started from that prior graph. An example here of kind of the impact that that's had is the initial large fuel break that we discussed with the CalVTP, the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break, that had about 30 minutes of public commentary, whereas there are actually 0 public comments for the Greater Nevada Shaded Fuel Break. So a really substantial contrast that we've seen here, as the MWPA has made a conscious effort over time to really engage with stakeholders and the public and kind of talk about their issues on that. And so I also wanted to thank the MWPA for their work with us, and they've been really crucial in helping us kind of get the information we need and get the data we need to be looking into the impactful work they're doing. And also just a huge thank you to the work they're doing in the local community to be protecting Marin County and reducing wildfire risk. And looking ahead, where is this research going in the future? So we're currently working on writing up what we've been doing so far with our work with the MWPA. And we hope that the findings can be of value to the MWPA, and we've been consulting them throughout this, is what would be the most effective way for us to use and present this research. And we're thinking perhaps other agencies coping with the challenging risk of reducing wildfire, perhaps we can work with them to kind of show the lessons that have been learned through the MWPA in kind of streamlining this environmental compliance process to increase the number of projects. And the Bill Lane Center plans to continue to stay engaged and collaborate with the MWPA to kind of help advance their work. So here are the sources I used. And thank you very much. Open to any questions, but feel free to also send me an email if you would like.
That's fantastic, Georgia. Thank you for just a really insightful and informative talk. I want to give a shout out to Mark Brown, who's here with us with MWPA. I know our Panorama rep had to leave a little bit early. Mark, I putting you on the spot, but do you have any comments to follow up before I open the questions for Georgia? Or maybe you can just be peppered with questions that Georgia doesn't want to answer in a moment. But I just want to give you the opportunity to at least have a couple minutes to speak.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the thoroughness of Georgia's work. And, you know, I did a lot of the focus was on our environmental compliance and our approach that we want to be ecologically sound. And I came into the MWPA a complete CEQA novice. I knew what it stood for. I didn't know how to use the system. And when we started the MWPA, we were thinking that we were going to have to help create create more streamlining processes for CEQA. But then what happens when you hire the right people? And Krelock, my planning and program manager, who has 18 years or more of experience in environmental compliance, and in a phenomenal firm like Panorama, we have shown that the current CEQA processes actually worked very efficiently for us. The CalVTP has been amazing for us, and we don't think that we are going to have to ever embark upon a project that involves an entire environmental impact report because of the CalVTP. So our hats off for that work. And the last thing I'll mention is what was really discussed thoroughly, is the importance of our stakeholder involvement and having our stakeholders involved in everything from the very beginning, bringing them along with us for the entire journey makes it so much easier. We're a very transparent organization. We're very reachable, which creates a lot of work on our end on the front side. But because of the effort that we're putting on the front end, we get less, we require less effort on the back end.
Yeah. No, let me just say, first of all, Georgia did an excellent job, but if there was a whole team that worked on this, as Georgia mentioned, so a lot of the work was done by students that we've had over the several years. And I think, Georgia, you have a career. You made it sound like a British documentary because you've got that BBC voice. We really appreciate that. You just brought us up a level. I don't know, Mark, you might want to put this video on your website or something, because it's a really nice summary of the work. And I completely agree with you that the engagement part is what I think a lot of communities really have to pay attention to. You knew about it because your group of fire chiefs had encountered some of these groups. And of course, the Bay Area is chock-a-block with nonprofit groups and neighborhood groups. It's a very well organized area. And so not every area of California has the same level of nonprofit engagement and environmental engagement. But certainly for the areas, particularly on the western side of California, where the environmental groups tend to be strongest, these are important lessons, and I think not well known. A couple times what I've mentioned, the work that we've been doing on the stakeholders because of what you guys were doing, people were surprised. They hadn't thought of that. So I think that when you think of, Mark has been very concerned that we try to spread some of the lessons that he learned out into the rest of California, because there are a lot of communities that are abutting WUI areas and need to do something. And so there are a number of lessons here that could be very valuable throughout the state. And I think the engagement one is certainly one of those.
I have to say, you read my mind about placing the video on our website. I would love to get that permission to do that.
Yeah.
We can talk about it. It shouldn't be a problem. I don't
Okay.
think it's a problem. We can talk
No,
about it.
I don't have
I
a
don't.
problem either. No. Esther, I don't know whether you want to say something. Esther was leading this summer's version of this, and whether you want to add anything or not. Where is Esther?
Yes,
There
I
she
am
is.
here. I'm sorry, apologies there for being off camera. I'm at a conference. But I am so glad to have decided to stick through the whole presentation, because Georgia, you did an amazing job, and really pleased to have you here, Mark, as well. It has been a really fascinating learning experience for me as well. Coming from more of a water policy background, to understand some of the details of how the environmental compliance happens. And I'm very excited about working with Georgia and the other students to write this up, to highlight some of these important lessons. And it's just been a pleasure to work with the MWPA on this.
Yeah, one thing I should mention is that I think one of the areas that we hope to explore with the MWPA is the whole question of who's insured for what, and what's the new reform, insurance reform, going to do. Because one possibility is that a lot of people will just decide to do without insurance. Right now, you've got a lot of different companies and many people underinsured, but there's a danger now that it may become so prohibitively expensive that some people are going to go completely uninsured. So I think that's one area that we like to see this project move in. There were some other areas that we've discussed, but we haven't done as much work on, which has to do with the water quality and the effect of burns on water, and we hope to pick that up. And then lastly, Mark suggested that areas in Marin that are covered by the Coastal Commission have a different set of regulatory processes they have to go through, and whether they're being expedited. I don't know whether, Mark, you have any update on that. Has the Coastal Commission adopted anything like some of the processes you've seen in the Cal VTP and the exemption process, et cetera?
Unfortunately, no. We are creating what's called a public works plan that will hopefully increase the speed at which we can get permits, but the connection between PWPs and the Cal VTP is still being improved upon, but it sounds like that's the direction that Coastal Commission staff wants to go.
Okay. I don't know whether anybody has any questions or.
Yeah, open it up to others. Questions or comments for you. You've got a couple people you can ask questions of here. Anyone have any questions for either Georgia or Mark? You can ask Bruce or Esther too, or myself.
Well,
Okay, I'll ask one. We're still waiting. I mean, I've been impressed both by the student work. Again, Georgia, great job. I think the students have done an amazing amount of work, and the MWPA has had an amazing amount of success in a very short amount of time. And if I believe I'm correct, the measure lasts for 10 years. Is that correct? Do you think it's going to be a hard sell to get the taxpayers to pony up for another decade of this? Because it just seems like it's so important, and I don't know, if you have to pay attention to that. I mean, I'm biased. I just think they'd be foolish not to. But are you concerned? Is there any concern that, as successful or as great work you've been doing, that you will have to resell it as a brand new package or something else? That'd be less than 7 years from now, right? You have to put this into play a lot earlier than that.
We're actually, we anticipate that we'll start some form of campaigning in 2028, just so that we can make sure that we can get everything through before 2030. Concern, maybe it's the wrong word, cognizant that we need to be able to go that, or make sure that we renew it. The amount of public support that we get, I'll just tell you a little story. We were out on a fire road the other day, working on a video, an evacuation safety video that we want to make. And we had a couple walking down the fire road. We had no identification that we were with the MWPA whatsoever. And they thanked us for all our work. So I really do think we have the visibility of the work that we're doing. But the problem with fire prevention is you're trying to, if you have no fires in your area, you have to prove a negative, right? And so one of the concerns that we have is that, let's say we do all the work and we have no wildfires that create, to say that our work did any good, people will say, well, we didn't need that work to be done. So one of the things that we're doing is we're embarking on very scientific modeling of all aspects of our work. We're modeling the decrease of risk that's being created from our defensible space work. We're modeling the decrease of risk from our evac routes and our shaded fuel breaks, such as the Greater Ross Valley and Greater Novato. So through the modeling, we're going to be able to show those risk reductions. We actually have measures of success drafted for those at a dashboard created on our website, but those pages are dark for now because we are still doing a fine tuning. But within the next several months, the public's actually going to be able to see the reduction in risk that we're creating.
Hey, Mark, one thing that we haven't done much on is policies that reduce the probability of ignition. For example, working with PG&E about power safety, power shutoffs, or burying lines, etc. Talk a little bit about what kind of relationships you have with PG&E and whether you have any say as to where they're burying lines or where or how they segment their grid in such a way that they could shut it off.
Great question. And PG&E is an interesting organization to deal with. And I can say that we feel that we have a very strong relationship, especially with our public safety specialists and the vegetation management personnel. And yes, we do have meetings with the public safety specialists when they are prioritizing either hardening of their infrastructure and or undergrounding their lines. We have had a say in those efforts, and also the creation of their microgrids, and also using the advanced technology of the reclosers, so that during the summer they can turn off the reclosers, so that if we have a limb strike, that and that's one of the lesser known things. And when a power line goes down, the circuit breaker opens. That's not what starts the fire. What starts the fire is when what they call reclosers automatically reclose the circuit, put energy back into that power line, that's when the fire starts. And they put those reclosers because during the winter, they might get a short-term snap to the line that causes the circuit to open, but it's still fine. And then so they have the recloser so they can continue power. Now they've started doing these advanced technologies, making the circuits smaller and have to turn off the recloser, so the ignitions have gone way down. So that's where we've been successful. We're continuing to work with PG&E to align our veg management work with their veg management work. And then another ignition source that we have in Miranda, everyone has it all across California, and that's from the unhoused. And we have several programs where we're working with the unhoused population to bring up awareness and decrease ignition from the unhoused.
Mm-hmm. So when PG&E buries lines, do they pay for it completely, or through their rates, or do say homeowners on a particular street end up paying for part of the burying of the lines?
You can have both circumstances. I'm not aware of homeowners paying for it in Marin. There have been some smaller local efforts to create some type of road. I forget, it's like a special district, a road special district, where they can come together as a community, decide to tax themselves. There's been some efforts towards that. I haven't heard of any being successful in Marin, but I imagine it has been successful outside of Marin. And one thing about Marin is we're nearly built out, so there's not a lot of new construction. And so, as you know, a lot of new construction throughout California, the developer is paying for the undergrounding of the power lines.
Right. Are there any other areas that you guys have declared that you don't want to see development because it's too dangerous, or are you so built out that that's not a concern?
We still have the housing mandate to increase housing. It's a policy decision that the MWPA doesn't have jurisdictional authority for. However, we work side by side with the county's community development agency and each of the city's planning departments, and we provide subject matter expertise, especially with a recent evacuation egress risk assessment that we've completed that shows fire modeling and transportation challenges for evacuations, and they can use that to help inform their decisions.
Very good.
That's really helpful. We are at 1:25. Any other questions? I appreciate all the great questions we have had here in discussion.
Well, once again, Georgia, that was great. And Mark, thanks so much for tuning in and being such a great partner. And, we'll work with you to maybe get this presentation so that you can put it on your website.
Yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah, Bruce and I will talk about that. It is recorded. And just for those of you still on the call, if you're interested in a slightly different approach, but a similar problem, stay tuned for next week. We have Chef Chalet from Fire Safe Council of Santa Clara County and looking at how do we manage things here in our own backyard. So I hope to see you there. And again, thank you so much, Georgia, and Bruce as well, and Mark, for your contributions. Have a great week, everyone. See you again soon.
Awesome work, Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.